Morning, Loomis.
Morning, sir.
No, just sit down, everybody. At these hearings, we dispense with most of the formalities. Let me see now. Operative litigants, please be good enough to fully identify yourself when I mention your names. In this matter of competency hearing, docketed and surrogate, get all this, Loomis? Said competency hearing is brought to this bench for adjudication by James Scott. I assume Mr. Scott is here?
Yes, I'm James Scott, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor, and I'm Consular J. Jamison, representing Mr. Scott and Scott Taylor Industries.
Mr. Scott, in instituting this competency hearing, you're asking relief from the willful, whimsical, irrational, disorderly, deliberate, irresponsible, incompetent. I don't know what it is. Maybe something they feed them in pre-law, but most lawyers I've known have a violent allergy toward the use of simple predicates. Ah, here we are at last. Relief from the defendant's malicious, financially destructive intervention in the lawful and orderly operation of Scott Taylor Industries. Intervention detrimental not only to said Scott Taylor Industries, but to the financial well-being of the defendant herself, Mrs. Scott.
I'm Andrea Scott, Your Honor.
Carl Rothman representing Mrs. Scott, Your Honor.
Mrs. Scott, what's your relationship to the plaintiff?
I am his mother.
All of us, in one way or another, work, and our jobs are a very important part of our lives. While it's true that we are good apart from what we do, it's also true that our inherent dignity not only expresses itself in our work, but it can and should be enhanced by that work. Your job not only enables you to support your family, it also can and should enable you to grow and develop and become more fully human. This is why you should look for a job that will stimulate your mind and challenge your will. A job that enables you to exercise initiative and assume responsibility. A job that you believe in, that helps you contribute to the lives of other people. Such a job may be demanding, but it will not be boring. Work isn't supposed to be drudgery. Even if hard, it should occasion satisfaction and even joy. Yes, a job is a very important part of our lives. It's a basic human right. But what happens if we lose our jobs? What do we do if we cannot find another?
What is your relationship to the Scott Taylor Corporation?
Minority stockholder and board member.
A company established by your late husband, Jonathan Scott?
That's right, Your Honor.
According to the terms of your late husband's will, you received 20% of common stock of that company?
Yes, sir.
This says that if Scott Taylor Board closes the Norristown supermarket, you're going to give your 20,000 shares of stock to the Workers' Alliance of Norristown.
That's right.
This is correct.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor.
Yes, Mr. Jameson.
Not only Mrs. Scott giving her shares to the Alliance, but the voting rights for that block of stock would all be going to one man, Mr. Samuel Wilcox, a man who has declared his opposition to the company on many, many occasions.
Mr. Wilcox,
I'm Sam Wilcox, Your Honor.
what's your relationship to the Workers' Alliance?
I'm the chairman.
I see. Well, Mr. Scott, you regard the proposed gift as evidence of your mother's incompetency, is that it?
Yes, we do, Your Honor.
Very well, you may make your opening statement, Mr. Jameson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Scott Taylor Industries started out as a string of grocery stores. Now, through efficient and hard-headed management, it has prospered, has now diversified into other areas of manufacturing and marketing. Now, we've grown, Your Honor, but our basic purpose has always remained the same: to deliver to the public goods and services of such a quality and at such a price as to make a profit for our shareholders. In a word, Your Honor, we are in the business of making money.
Well,
Now,
thanks a lot for the commercial, Mr. Jameson. But what's that got to do with whether or not Mrs. Scott is incompetent?
Your Honor, I'd like to object to the use of the word incompetent in the charge at all. To say that Mrs. Scott can't vote her stock or conduct her business affairs is the equivalent of saying that she's insane, that she should be locked up or something.
That isn't true, Mr. Rothman. To say that someone is incompetent is simply to say that they cannot personally manage their own business affairs reasonably.
Yes, I understand.
Or that they cannot look out for their own welfare, and possibly they've come under the undue influence of someone else. Now, that's a far cry from insanity.
I understand that, and I appreciate the legal meaning of the term, Your Honor. All I'm trying to suggest here is that what is at stake is not my client's competency. It's the business practices of Scott Taylor Industries. Mr. Jameson puts it very well. They're in the business of making money. But the one thing he doesn't say is that they don't care about anything else. They put profits before people.
Hey, now, just a second. I don't think...
Were my client
All right.
not protesting certain immoral business practices of Scott Taylor Industries, then they would not be questioning her competency, and we wouldn't be here today.
But we are here today, Mr. Rothman. Mr. Jameson has the floor.
Thank you, Your Honor. And thank you for your apt and succinct description of incompetency. As this hearing progresses, Mr. Rothman, I think we will find that, unfortunately, Mrs. Scott qualifies at all the points you mentioned, Your Honor.
Can you be specific?
Yes, Your Honor. Some time ago, our board decided to close down the Norristown supermarket. Now, Mrs. Scott did not agree with that decision, but she was voted down. Yet she could not bring herself to accept the will of the majority. In a very willful and deliberate manner, in a very destructive manner, she took her case from our boardroom where it belonged to labor halls, newspapers, and television talk shows. She disclosed information reserved only to board members. Now, she has publicly embarrassed the company with the result that its stock has dropped 4 points in the last 3 months. Now, in doing so, she has not only hurt her company, she has also hurt herself. Now, our arguments will, I believe, convince the court that we deserve permanent relief from her unstable and incompetent disruption of our business affairs. Now, what? Oh, all right. Mr. Scott said he would like to conclude the opening statements.
I don't see why not. Go ahead, Mr. Scott.
Yeah, I just want to be very clear about what we think the issue is here. My mother has every right to speak her mind, to make her points as strongly as she can, to choose her supporters. That's her right under the First Amendment. But when she decides to protest a board decision by threatening to give away 20,000 shares of our company to Mr. Wilcox and his followers, that's just not sound, reasonable, or responsible behavior. Such an action could open the door to divided control of our company. It could threaten its effective management, and that could only hurt our stockholders. My mother's threat to do this is a kind of blackmail to get her own way regardless. I'm sorry, but I think that's evidence of incompetency as you have described it.
We'll hear further testimony after a brief intermission.
Let's quote these percentages and you read them to the judge, all right?
Yep.
That'll show the decline, okay? All right. Let's see.
Jim, I'm really sorry for your sake that this has gone so far.
Thank you, Mother. That makes it all better.
Well, you left me no choice.
Oh, come on, Mother. You've undermined my credibility with the stockholders. You've embarrassed me before the board. You've threatened my control of the company. You left me no choice.
I just don't understand why you can't run the company the way your father did. He cared as much for the employees.
My father isn't
and
running the
customers
company
as...
now, Mother. I am, and these are different times. Demands of doing business have changed, and so have business practices.
Oh, I don't buy that for a minute, Jim. And because I don't, you think I'm an incompetent idiot. Is that right?
Mother, please, you don't seem to understand the situation. It's nothing personal.
That's just your problem, Jim. There's nothing personal with you.
Some time ago, our computers, analyzing the shift in urban population and the changing trends in buying power, started to project a downturn at our Norristown facility. Even though the projection was proven correct, we decided to do everything we could to reverse the trend and keep that unit functioning.
What steps did you take to keep the unit functioning?
We sent marketing experts down there. We ran point-of-sale experiments, but nothing helped.
It's because you wouldn't listen.
And so we made the only decision possible, to cut our losses and close down.
But isn't it a fact, Mr. Scott, that you never once responded to the invitations of the Workers' Alliance to come and discuss the possibility?
But that is not
Your Honor, with your, James, please, with your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to answer that question.
Go ahead.
First of all, our company lawyers did, in fact, meet with the so-called Norristown Workers Alliance. That's an ad hoc group of workers chaired by a clerk at our Norristown store, Mr. Wilcox.
Your Honor, that occasion was hardly a discussion. Mrs. Scott offered to turn her seat on the board over to Mr. Wilcox, and management refused.
The management refused because, you know, with all due respect, Mr. Wilcox, he had nothing to offer the board. He had no administrative experience. He had no business background. He was not a stockholder. In short, he met none of the qualifications, Your Honor.
He had nothing to offer the board, Your Honor, except hard, concrete knowledge of that store and its customers and their lives and needs. Now, my client thinks that Mr. Wilcox can help turn that store around because she's courageous enough to believe in the novel idea that workers should be involved in decisions that affect their lives.
Mr. Scott, what's at stake here? How many people go on the street if you close the Norristown store?
179, Your Honor.
Well, your company has had a supermarket in that area earning profit for over 32 years. I think it's fair to ask you this question. What steps has your company taken to ease the effects of the shutdown?
We try to follow an orderly procedure, Your Honor. We have offered 2 weeks severance pay for every year they've been with the company, plus full medical and dental benefits, on condition that the Alliance and its members cease all protest activities.
I see.
We've had meetings to explain how to prepare resumes, how to take maximum advantage of state benefits, such as unemployment, food stamps, welfare.
Do you regard this as an obligation on your part or a work of charity?
I don't understand the question.
Yeah, Your Honor, if I may answer, that we are a business, not a charity. Now, there's a limit to the amount of inefficiency we're able to subsidize. The Norristown operation is losing money. We have no choice.
That's your choice, but what about our choice? What we are talking about here is survival.
Survival demands adaptation, Mr. Wilcox. You've got to learn to adapt. You've got to help us break these wasteful, subsidized patterns.
Help you. Helping you would be like digging a hole to bury us in.
You see, Your Honor, that's just the attitude we can't work with. We can't work with that.
Go ahead, Mr. Scott.
Believe me, Your Honor, none of this would have happened if my mother hadn't come under the influence of Sam Wilcox. Mrs. Scott, picketing Scott Taylor Industries. Oh, the media loved it. And our competitors, how they enjoyed the spectacle of my mother carrying an inflammatory placard, going on talk shows, misrepresenting company policy and behaving like a woman who'd lost her senses.
Yeah, really.
Mr. Scott, I hope that you're not contending your mother is incompetent simply because she disagrees with you.
We'll just have to stick with the facts, Andrea. And don't let them rattle you.
No, that's easy to say. Wait till that Jameson really starts in.
Oh, good afternoon.
Well,
Mrs.
hello, Ellen.
Hope you're satisfied.
What do you mean, honey?
Oh, I think that should be obvious. I mean, once again, you are the center of attention. And forget the damage you're doing to Jim.
Excuse me. I'll see you inside.
He's the one who dragged me into court. You surely can't think that I want to be here, be publicly humiliated by my son.
He's doing it because he has to save you from yourself.
Oh, Ellen, that is utter nonsense. That's justification, nothing more. The root of this matter is money, just like everything else in Jim's life. And for the first time in my life, I'm beginning to think about where all of that money came from, who made it for us, and what we owe them.
Don't you think you owe Jim something? He is running the company now, you know that? I mean, it's not easy always being compared with your father. Now, if you want to feel guilty for being privileged, then that is your right. But don't make the rest of us suffer along with you.
The things Mrs. Scott always cared about just didn't matter anymore. Gardening, for one thing, and entertaining. She even stopped helping the people she used to help, and she stopped letting me help her.
Could you tell us exactly what you mean by that?
Well, we had a place in the community. I mean, the Scott family did, you understand. We always had a garden concert in the spring and a fundraising party at the end of the year before the holidays. Then when Mrs. Scott met Mr. Wilcox, all that stopped. She just didn't have time for it, she said.
You think Mr. Wilcox was responsible for that change?
I don't know. But she sure changed.
Was it about this time that she moved out of her home and took an apartment in the Norristown district?
Yes, sir. Well, she didn't even take a car with her. She used the bus down there. We were all so worried about her.
Did she give you any explanation for this behavior?
Yes, sir, she tried. But frankly, I don't understand it.
And according to a survey done by both management and labor, over 15 million jobs have been lost in this country in the last decade due to plant closings. And management's total disregard of the domino effect, if you will, of these closings constitutes a real kind of corporate violence in America today.
Oh, no, Mr. Rotten, hold on. I can't let you lay this guilt trip on us. If we cannot close down an unprofitable operation, we destroy the very basis of the free enterprise system.
But you're forgetting about the neighborhoods you destroy in the process.
I'm not forgetting about the neighborhoods.
And the protection
we have great
of
concern.
people without money has to remain extra legal.
No, that's not so. We have programs to try to...
Gentlemen. Mr. Jameson, please.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Forgive me, I'm sorry.
I ask your indulgence for one further general comment, Your Honor. Let's just look at the domino effect of these closings in the Norris District itself. On the word that a Scott Taylor operation was closing down, a savings and loan bank canceled plans to open a branch here, an automobile dealer closed down, and ironically, the gas and water companies in the Norris District cite a decline in usage as a reason for raising rents throughout the whole district.
Mr. Rothman, will you please get to the issue of the competency of your client?
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to hear from Mrs. Scott herself now.
Well, I'm not sure where to start, Your Honor. Obviously, I have been a very disruptive sort of person, at least as far as my son's company is concerned. I was just trying to save some jobs. And again, obviously, I have not been successful. When my husband died, I was devastated. I stopped seeing people, and I started thinking about things that I'd never thought about before.
Like what?
Like how I'd been living, and like what I was supposed to be doing with this life of mine. A lot of things began to seem very empty. And then I got a call from Mr. Wilcox, and he came to see me about the closing of the Norristown store. Now, what I heard from him was very different from what I had heard at the board meetings.
The way you describe it, Mrs. Scott, what you saw as the workers' plight came at a very convenient time in your life. A time when you were looking for something to fill the void left by the death of your husband?
Maybe that's one way of looking at it, and maybe it's because I was becoming aware of how things are with a lot of people, and maybe because I was beginning to care a little bit about them. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people will be losing their jobs. And most of them have been with Scott Taylor for a long time, and I think this is just terrible.
We've done all we can. They're not our responsibility.
Well, if not ours, whose?
I don't know. But I do know that the people with purchasing power have moved to the suburbs, and we're going to follow the pattern.
That is marketplace morality. Follow the trend, go for the profit, and ignore the right of poor people for jobs.
Mrs. Scott.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this. Why did you leave your home and move to the Norristown district, refusing to use your automobile, and leaving the members of your family to worry about the possibility of you being assaulted?
Because I couldn't honestly speak about the problems of the workers unless I experienced them. That's why I rode the buses and the subway. And I stayed at the market the same hours they did. I wanted to feel the same things they were feeling. And to be quite honest, I also wanted to find out if I had the courage to put my money where my mouth was. You see, Judge, a job is a badge of respect. It means that you're a part of the community, that you're pulling your own weight. And no one has the right to withhold this from people.
Well, those are worthy sentiments, Mrs. Scott, but let's be practical. If I impose no restraint on your stocks and other assets, could you give me any assurance that you could save the jobs threatened in that area?
Not by myself, Your Honor, but working together with the Alliance and the company, oh, I'm sure we could bring it off.
Well, what do you say to that, gentlemen?
Well, Your Honor, Mrs. Scott is wrong. Those jobs can't be saved. We just better face that. I mean, it's a fact of life.
Only if money is more important than people. You see, I'd always taken money for granted, and I'm just now beginning to find out how much good it can do. Now, if that stock goes to the Alliance, then they can at least see that their kids get a decent education.
What proportion of your assets does that stock represent?
I don't know, but 90%, I suppose.
And this idea of giving the money away, did that originate with you?
No, it did not.
Well, can you tell us whose idea it was?
Oh, originally, yes. It was Mr. Wilcox's idea.
Mr. Wilcox, you've been here since the start of the hearings, and you've known Mrs. Scott for some time. What do you think of her competency to manage her own affairs?
I think Mrs. Scott is a caring woman. Maybe she's too caring for her own good. You know, Your Honor, the people down at the Alliance don't want charity. They don't want welfare or handouts or food stamps. I know that standing in a line with a fistful of stamps can cut a man down 2 feet tall. You know, other people have good, clean American money that they work for. And all you've got is a handful of stamps that says to everybody around that you can't cut it.
Mr. Wilcox, I'm sure that everyone is sympathetic to the plight of the unemployed, but what I was trying to get here was an informed opinion as to the reasonableness of Mrs. Scott's actions.
Well, what do you mean reasonable?
Well, for example, if you were to possess 20,000 shares of Scott Taylor stock, would you be willing to donate it to this Workers' Alliance?
Well, I don't know how to answer the question. I know what you're all thinking. That I figured I was on to a good thing, and that I would flim-flam this lady. But that simply is not true. I didn't want her money. I told Mrs. Scott, just let me vote the stock. Get me on the board so that I could at least talk to you guys. And how can you sit here and judge this lady when all she was simply trying to do was to help?
That's enough, Mr. Wilcox.
And I told her at the very start, I said, there is no way they're gonna let you give away that money.
I think we have heard quite enough. There seems to be two separate issues that we're arguing here. Whether or not Mrs. Scott is competent to manage her own business affairs, especially where it affects the Scott Taylor Corporation, and whether that corporation has the obligation to its employers and to the Norristown area to keep its supermarket open there. This court has jurisdiction in the first. It has none in the second.
Your Honor, if this court has no such jurisdiction, which court does?
I know of none, Mr. Rothman. No corporation can be compelled to go into debt.
Am I to conclude, then, that the closing of the Norristown supermarket has the blessing of this court?
You are to conclude no such thing, Mr. Rothman. All I can do is decide in the competency of Mrs. Scott, and that I intend to do. Now, Mrs. Scott, if I could work out some kind of probationary arrangement, would you give me your word to cease interfering with the business of the Scott Taylor Industries?
No, Your Honor, I would not.
Would you be willing to resign from the board?
Yes, I would relinquish my seat if Mr. Wilcox were nominated to replace me.
You're making my job very difficult. Suppose you were to retain the ownership of your stock.
No.
And donate the dividends to the people of the Workers' Alliance.
No, I want that to go back to them. I've learned how to live very simply, and I prefer it.
Mrs. Scott, by your own admission, you were devastated by the death of your husband. You may believe it was your decision and yours alone to give away this money. But you seem to be unaware of the vulnerability that you had at the time and how you may have been influenced by Mr. Wilcox.
Oh, this
Your
isn't
Honor,
true
with
at
all
all.
due
Miss-
respect,
no,
you're
really.
subjecting my client to a
Sit down, Mr.
psychological
Rothman.
analysis.
Sit down. Mrs. Scott, you leave me no alternative. In light of your refusal to forgo the undue influence of Mr. Samuel Wilcox and taking into account the reckless disposition of your personal finances, monies that could provide you throughout life, and that your descendants may reasonably expect to inherit, and mindful that your current living circumstances may jeopardize your personal safety, I hereby grant the petition before this court and appoint James Scott as conservator.
Your Honor, I protest, and once again, I'd like my
You can
protest
appeal,
reflected in the
Mr.
record.
Rothman.
Thank you.
Loomis, would you give this to Mr. Scott to sign, please?
Food, clothes, cars, TV sets, hi-fis, a house. All of us own some things, and many of us own quite a bit. Most of us have what we need, and some of us have more than we need. There's no sin in being rich, and there's no sin in being poor. But there's a very great sin in having more than we need and not sharing with those who have less than they need. The ownership of property is private, but its use must be social. It must take into consideration the welfare of other people. It's important that we seek our own good, but it's also important that we concern ourselves with the common good, with the welfare of society as a whole, with the needs of other people, especially with those who have less than they need. Such a concern must be a permanent part of our decision-making process. After all, human values come before economic ones. People are more important than things. Is this good business? I think so. But even if it were not, it's what God expects of us. He lives in a very special way in the poor and the put upon. And he enriches us in a very special way when we reach out to share ourselves with them. Try it. You might be surprised. The poor may have more to give to you than you have to give to them.